Hey everybody, I wanted to talk about what I think is one of the greatest tabletop games ever designed, and the game which is taking up most of my attention right now when I'm not working or flying. That's Android Netrunner Reboot, or Rebooted. Android Netrunner is an old Fantasy Flight card game that got me into board gamings to begin with, which was tragically canned after an intellectual property dispute with Wizards of the Coast in 2018. Um, Netrunner is criminally underappreciated, so I'm happy to announce that it's living on with a second life as part of Abram Jobs' Reboot project. And that's him in the bottom left corner. He goes by the Big Boy, and he's a former Netrunner pro player who restarted the game circa its golden age with rebalanced cards. And you can play it with me right now. I wanted to share this with my audience because, as a diehard Netrunner fan myself, I didn't even know Reboot existed until I stumbled upon Goblin Mode's channel, who is a YouTuber that also makes Reboot videos, which I'll link in the description. Okay, so what's Netrunner? For those who don't know already. Originally, it's a cyberpunk-inspired asymmetrical two-player card game designed by Richard Garfield from the 90s, where one player takes on the role of a megacorporation trying to enact an evil agenda, and the other plays as a hacker trying to steal company secrets from the other one. The game reaches apex in 2012 when Fantasy Flight licensed it from Garfield, in this case, essentially Wizards of the Coast, and started their own modernized version under the lead design of Lucas Litzinger, pictured here. Originally, ANR was designed in the radical LCG or living card game model. Much like a game like Dude Imperium or Slay the Spire, it promised players that if they kept up to date with game expansions, they could have access to the entire card pool. There's no rare chasing, there's no reserve list, none of that commercial nonsense that you have to deal with. Sure, there were a lot of expansions, but as long as you bought them all, you got all the cards. Now, in Reboot, we operate on an even more radically egalitarian principle. You get all the cards for free. So, everything in the entire card pool is available to everybody. And here's a card back you can see right here of the very first 90s Deckmaster Netrunner card backs. So, there's two versions of the game. Original Netrunner that Garfield designed, and then Fantasy Flight Netrunner, which Lucas designed. And now there's a third version, which is Reboot Netrunner. There's also a fourth version called Nisei Group Netrunner, or if you're familiar with Null Signal games, they have their own version. I didn't really like that version that much, and it kind of went in a different direction from what I think the core principles of the game are. So if you're familiar with Nisei's Netrunner game, just know that this is a alternative format to that, basically. Okay, so what does Reboot actually do? So Reboot essentially takes the card pool frozen in time from 2016. It's taking the 2016 card pool, that's every card released up until Data and Destiny, which is one of the big box Fantasy Flight expansions. Now, the interesting design philosophy that Big Boy has, the first thing is he does not ban cards. There are a ton of insanely broken Fantasy Flight cards that realistically had to be banned. But because we're playing a mostly digital format and a rebalanced format, Big Boy is able to take those cards and essentially nerf them until they could not be banned anymore. And because he has all this freedom on balancing the cards, what he can do is he can essentially say, we're never going to ban a card. If a card's too good, we're just going to nerf it until it's not a problem anymore, essentially. So that's the first thing. No banning cards. The second thing is that he tries, in general, there might be one exception to this or two, but I can't think of more than one, to only make one variable change per card. This is quite helpful for a former player like me, because if you look at cards and you remember them, but you don't remember them perfectly, you might be thinking, well, okay, so I know this has been buffed, but I don't remember where it's been buffed and which numbers. The nice thing about this is that you don't have to memorize all that. There's only going to be one variable that's changed per card. If you know which one it is, then you don't have to go looking for other ones. Sometimes this means that some cards are so weak that even if their cost is reduced all the way down to zero, they still might not be necessarily competitive. But it's throwing a bone to the people that want to play with the card, which I appreciate. It's a fundamentally conservative design philosophy of trying to preserve what was good about Netrunner when it was in its prime. And then the last thing, which is less conservative, and I think is kind of interesting, is that he does occasionally, very rarely, add new cards to the game to accentuate the card pool. So there were some archetypes in the original game which were pretty undercooked. Things like Hospire Brain Damage, for example, that Big Boy will occasionally release new cards to support. Generally speaking, when I first started playing Reboot, I was not necessarily a fan of this idea, but most of the cards that he adds are not very competitive, and they're support cards at best. So the game is still defined by the principles and the cards that were important during the game's heyday, even if these other things maybe add new archetypes or maybe make existing archetypes a little bit stronger. Taking C tier decks, turning them into B tier decks doesn't necessarily offend me. Okay, so I was going to start originally by talking about a retrospective on the core set of Netrunner and how all those cards have been impacted by the Reboot project. But instead, it occurred to me that basically because of the way that the Netrunner card pool has been changed for Reboot, all the cards to the core set, there's no expansions for anyone to buy. So a card from the Underway or the Sansan Cycle or Data and Destiny is as much of a core set card as a card from the very first pack. So I'm going to, instead of talking about the core set specifically, I am going to be talking about the core set as all the cards, but focusing mostly on the staples and going by faction so that people can understand kind of what each faction's about, the most important cards in each faction, and how they've been changed by the Reboot project. So the first faction is the Anarchs. And this is the runner faction that is the most focused on destruction. There's different factions in the game, if you're not familiar. There's 3 major factions of runners: Anarchs, Criminals, and Shapers. And they each have a different color pie and a different way of dealing with problems in the game. And Anarch primarily is about smashing sandcastles. They look at their opponents building up these impressive servers and castles of iron defenses, and they just want to take a hammer to it. Anarch, for me, is the most fun of the runner factions, and we're going to be talking about the leaders that you can play in the Anarch faction and the majority of the most important cards in that faction. So starting with the very first leader of the Anarch faction that came out in the original Fantasy Flight core set, we have Noise. And Noise is kind of interesting as an inclusion in a core set because despite the fact that it's an introductory product for people, Noise actually has a very non-standard playstyle. Noise is a mill deck. So naturally he is very controversial. And the original Noise had the basic stat line that most runners have of 45 and 15. 45 being the minimum deck size that he can have, and 15 being the amount of influence he can spend to import cards from other factions. So primarily the way that runners are going to get balanced in the Reboot project is by lowering or increasing their influence. Sometimes their effects will change, and we're going to have some very interesting cases of that when we get to the Shaper faction, but for the most part, influence is the way things are balanced. And as it turned out, Noise was very powerful. His playstyle was a little bit passive. He ended up mostly sitting back and mass installing virus cards and then making one massive run towards the opponent's discard pile to pick up all of the points that got thrown into the discard pile. So that's the way that original Noise used to work. And basically he's had his influence massacred. So Noise went from a 45-15 to a 45-10. What that hurts him less than you would think, because the vast majority of virus cards are Anarch cards anyway, but it does prohibit Noise from being able to spend lots of influence on Shaper cards like Clone Chip, which are going to make his virus game plan more versatile. So now Noise kind of has to be stuck more in that specific side of playing things. Noise is tremendous fun. There's a number of people that do not like him, but I enjoy multiple things about the leader. First, he makes the archives a relevant server. It means that the corporation now has to defend 3 centrals instead of 2, and there's just something fundamentally exciting about milling the opponent's deck and not knowing if there's a point in there. Now that we're actually talking about the card pool, I should say, I'm not going to explain the mechanics of Netrunner. I realize that if you don't know what Netrunner is, a lot of this is jargon to you. But ultimately, I don't have time to explain the entire game's rule set. But I'm going to link some videos in the description that talk about this. But basically, the reason that Noise is good is because even though the game is extremely asymmetrical, both the runner and the corporation are trying to win by contesting a subset of the cards in the corporation's deck called agendas. The agendas are the cards that have points on them, and Noise can randomly mill those cards. And the runner gets to access cards from the zones of the corporation's deck, either the deck itself, their hand, or their discard pile. The runner can sneak into those spaces and access those cards. And so what Noise will do is he will mill the corporation and then go and access those cards. So back to people who actually know how Netrunner works. Noise is controversial because it is possible for Noise to essentially win the game after installing 3 or 4 viruses. It's not probable, but it's quite possible. I find it very enjoyable. Part of the tension, the deck building tension of Noise, is that virus cards, generally speaking, do not break ice. So you have to devote a certain amount of your deck to this energy, but the more you put into viruses, the less space you have for doing other efficient things. So it's an interesting deck building challenge for players. Okay, next we're going to talk about StimHack. StimHack is pretty interesting in that it's a card that was not changed at all between the original game and Netrunner Reboot. It's a classic card, super fun card, and ironically, it's not much of an Anarch card. It's a 1 influence card. You can see the influence pips down at the bottom here, which means it's very easy for other factions to use StimHack. And generally speaking, it's used by remote camping and R&D locking runners, aka shapers for the most part. So even though this card is delightfully Anarch, it's mostly played out of the Shaper faction. It's always been pretty balanced. You get this giant bomb that lets you crack open a server with 9 credits that you can spend on the run, but then you get an unpreventable brain damage afterwards, which can add up after a while. So, StimHack, classic card, great. Glad that it wasn't changed. I only wish there were more Anarch decks that were interested in playing StimHack, perhaps. The card also has an interesting interaction with a Shaper card called Personal Workshop. We're going to talk about that later when we get to Shapers. Next we have Grimoire. Grimoire was the classic original console for Noise that came out in the game's core set. And surprisingly, Grimoire was actually not changed at all. Grimoire, I think, was a little bit too efficient. It provides 2 memory units for $3. That's a very good rate, even if it didn't have the virus effect. So I'm a little surprised that it hasn't been nerfed, but I'm not complaining. Viruses are an extremely fun strategy, and I certainly love playing my Grimoire. This is somewhat unrelated to the gameplay, but I do think it's funny that technically this is not Noise's console. This is actually Wizard's console, which you can tell based on both the flavor of the actual card and also the flavor text, but it's 100% for Noise. Grimoire, the effect of it, if you're not familiar, is that it allows you to pre-install all your virus cards with an extra virus counter on them. We're going to get to some applications of that later, but basically what it means is that a card like Parasite will instantly kill a 1 strength ice, and you can start at an advantage with cards like Data Sucker. Grimoire is a good card in a good place. The other Anarch consoles are mostly not strong enough on a comparison. I don't think I've ever played Vigil compared to this, but it is a nice standard card to have, and certainly it's not so overpowered that other factions are spending influence on it. Generally speaking, Desperado is better for criminals, and shapers have their own options. So it is nice that even if the card is a little bit dominant, it hasn't really breached containment in terms of spreading over to the other factions. Okay, so now we're going to talk about probably the most essential element of the Anarchs in the core set, the most defining feature of their gameplay, and that's the fixed strength breakers. Now, they're often called fixed strength breakers, even though only 2 of them have fixed strength. It's true that there is a third fixed strength breaker called Morningstar, but nobody plays it because it's so inefficient, which is ironic given the fact that Anarchs are supposed to be pretty good at breaking barriers. Anyway, we're going to talk about these cards. If you ever watched Willingdon's videos on the core set and on the original Netrunner cards, he contended that the icebreakers were too efficient relative to the ice in the game. Ice being the cards that keep runners out of servers and basically are the traps that the corporation lays for them, and icebreakers are the ways that runners have to break those traps and get around them. And Willingdon contended that ultimately the ice was too efficient relative to the icebreakers, and it broke the fundamental axis of interaction in the game. And on that matter, he's right. It's true that in original early Netrunner, the breakers were simply too strong relative to the ice. Now, the way that Big Boy has tried to address this is not by necessarily hurting the icebreakers, which I think was the solution that I had in mind and many other people, but in fact he just responded by buffing ice across the board. So even though Corroder is no weaker in Reboot than it was in, or Mimic are no weaker than they were in the original Netrunner game, in practice they end up a little bit weaker because the ice is more efficient across the board, which is an acceptable solution. So Corroder, this is a good chance for us to talk about the way that ice works. There's 3 different subtypes of ice, typically speaking. You have barriers, you have sentries, and you have decoders. And those ice can only be broken by icebreakers with corresponding types. So a fractor is an icebreaker that breaks barriers. A killer is an icebreaker that breaks sentries, and a decoder is a icebreaker that breaks code gates. So the defining feature of these ice, at least the last 2, is that they have a limited strength number being the bottom number here. 3 in the case of Mimic and Yogg, and that number cannot be increased by the ice. Corroder, on the other hand, is sort of the icebreaker. It's the template for the most standard possible efficient icebreaker. You can spend $1 to break a subroutine, and you can spend $1 to increase its strength. So that becomes notable when you see that the +1 strength option is not present on Mimic or Yogg. And what that means is Mimic and Yogg are extremely efficient at breaking ice with 3 strength or less, but become very inefficient at breaking ice higher than that strength. You can supplement them with strength increase or lowering technology, but you're going to have to invest in those things if you want to use this rig. Corroder is very efficient, and I think Corroder speaks to the fact that barriers are fundamentally easier to deal with than the other types of ice. Corroder is cheap, barriers are cheap. The point of a barrier is to keep somebody out of a server, and it basically asks the question, do you have your Corroder or not? Whereas sentries, the goal of sentries is to punish the runner. If you run into a sentry and you do not have a killer installed, it can often be very bad for you. Sentries are where a lot of the fun of the game, especially from the corporation's perspective, comes from. Because getting someone to faceplant into your diabolical trap is quite enjoyable. What Mimic and Yogg do is they create an interesting gradient, where some of the ice is either much more or much less valuable depending on their strength amounts. These are not the only icebreakers in the game, but a card like Architect, which we'll get to when we talk about Hospbioroid, is a 3 strength sentry, so it becomes very, very important if you want to run into Architect that you have your Mimic installed. But not everybody plays Mimic, so sometimes Architect can still be pretty efficient. Whereas 4 strength sentries suddenly become much more powerful because Mimic can't deal with them, unless it has a data stucker counter or something similar. Now, Yogg is probably the most interesting of the three. Yogg is the most controversial of the three. The original Yogg .0, or Yogg Point Not, as some English people call it, is interesting because it breaks code gates for nothing. Just for nothing. You pay 0 and the subroutine is broken. This is very radical. Most icebreakers, almost all icebreakers, cost money to use. As soon as a Yogg comes down, most code gates, 3 strength or below, are completely useless. They do nothing. They cost money to put up, and they give you nothing in return. I have long considered Yogg to be a broken card for this reason. It limits the design space of the game in the sense that the low strength code gates have really no purpose, since they're instantly broken by Yogg. However, in the Reboot project, this is much less the case. And there's a few reasons for this. The first, we're going to see right here that Yogg has cost increased by 1 credit. 1 credit is not a lot, but it does add up. And 5 to 6 is a very important number. Everyone starts the game with 5 credits. So what that means is you cannot install Yogg on your first click of the game. Clicks being your usage of time. You can't install Yogg on the first click of the game. So if you do install Yogg, you have to gain some money first, and that may be very expensive for you, especially if you didn't start the game with a sure gamble. So the cost nerf is quite significant, and then the card, both Mimic and Yogg, suffer disproportionately in Reboot from the fact that Ice has been significantly buffed. So, for example, Victor 1.0 used to be a 3 strength code gate that just got obliterated by Yogg. Well, now it's a 4 strength code gate. So Yogg, even though historically it's been a broken card, is actually quite balanced in Reboot. And there's many decks that don't play Yogg for that reason. Okay, next is Data Sucker. And Data Sucker is interesting because if you look at the commentary on the game for most of its lifespan, I think many people will have pointed to Data Sucker as being sort of a nexus of evil and problems in the game. And I myself had been somebody who had said that I thought that Data Sucker should have been banned. But as it exists in the card pool right now, it's not especially broken. Again, much of that comes from the fact that the Ice has across the board been buffed, which is very important and necessary. So Data Sucker, every time you make a successful run on a central server, that means the corporation's discard pile, hand, or deck, you get a virus counter on it, and you can use those virus counters to lower the strength of Ice. So, of course, the synergy with the fixed strength breakers is obvious. You can use them, the Data Sucker, to push the breakers, or you can push Ice into the breaker's range. And it's also used with Parasite, which we'll get to later, to potentially invalidate some Ice. Data Sucker is an interesting card. It's cheap to install. It only costs 1 MU, and it only has 1 influence. So it's very easy to bring Data Sucker over in other factions. The criminal faction especially loves Data Sucker because they're based around making runs. But in order to make the full use of Data Sucker, you actually have to have some kind of advantage gained from decreasing the strength of Ice, or you just have to have an advantage that you can gain from having oodles and oodles of virus counters. Freedom Kumalo used to be a leader that was able to use the second one. Unfortunately, Freedom is not available in Reboot, so there's nothing to use there. Data Sucker is interesting in that having 11 virus counters isn't necessarily all that useful unless you can find a way to get something out of it. For Criminals, for example, Criminals are the faction that uses Icebreakers the least, so they may not necessarily have anything all that good to do with Data Sucker. It just depends. The card's interesting. I would say balanced. I would have probably nerfed it, but Big Boy chose not to, and the sky is not falling. The card basically works fine. Okay. The next one is Medium. Medium is a win condition for the Anarch faction. Just like with Data Sucker, Medium operates on virus counters, which, as you might note, is a tribal focus of the Anarch faction. If you see here, because Medium and Zetaslicker are both viruses, when installed, they will trigger noise, milling the corporation 1 card. Also, if you have a Grimoire, they will start with 1 free virus counter. And what Medium does is it basically allows you to hammer the opponent's deck heavily. If you have an uncontested Medium, the corporation will sooner or later lose the game, typically. If they're a fast advanced deck and they have the right tools, maybe they can get around it, but generally speaking, the first time you make a successful run with Medium, you access 1 card, second time 2 cards, third time 3 cards, and it just goes up from there. Eventually, if you can see your opponent's entire deck, they're not getting out of it. Now, the corporation has a basic action where they can choose to skip their turn, and if they do, they can remove all virus counters from the board. That is one possible way of dealing with Medium. But remember that if they're doing that, they're skipping their turn. You just time-walked them. So Medium can be an effective card. And the interesting thing about Medium is, even though it has 3 influence here, and it was not nerfed, it is played in all 3 factions of Runner. I would say it's played least in Criminal. Criminals don't use a ton of Medium for the most part because they have other win conditions and other play style besides locking up R&D, which is the opponent's deck. But Shapers use this card, Anarchs use this card, and even the occasional Criminal will also consider using a Medium as well. So Medium is an extremely powerful, fun, and relatively interesting card that went unnerfed. It's a staple of the Anarch experience. Next is Parasite. Parasite is really a card that ties together so much of what the Anarch faction is doing. I think it's important that we talk about it. It was a defining card in original Netrunner, and it has been slightly nerfed here by increasing its cost by 1 credit. Now, 1 credit doesn't sound like a lot, but realize that if you're spamming Parasites over and over again, it is going to add up. What Parasite does is it infests a piece of ice, and over time it accumulates virus counters and lowers the strength of that ice. Once the ice is brought to 0, then the ice dies. And so does the Parasite. So Parasite works very well with Datasucker, because if you have, 5 Datasucker counters, virus counters on Datasucker, you put a Parasite on a big ice, and then you run into it with the Datasucker, you can instantly kill the ice. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that Parasite lowers the strength of ice for the fixed strength breakers. So if you run into an Ichi, which is a very high strength sentry that Mimic cannot break, you can put a virus on it, you can put a Parasite virus on it, and lower its strength that Mimic can get through. It's a virus card for noise, and it just kind of ties everything that the faction does together. It also illustrates that Anarchs, generally speaking, their approach to ice is to destroy it. Criminals like to bypass or get around it. Anarchs like to destroy it, and Shapers like to economically efficiently break it. So it's a paradigmatic card for the Anarch faction. And the abusive thing about Parasite that made it so strong back in its heyday was the ability for Parasite to be instantly instantly added to an ice in the middle of a run using cards like Clone Ship or Self-Modifying Code. And that's where the cost nerf really comes into play, because Clone Ship and Self-Modifying Code cost credits to use, and the credit tax on the Parasite's going to add up if you do that enough. So Parasite's an absolutely defining card, and it also has an effect on the way that Strength on Ice works. Very, very efficient ice with low strength, like, for example, Pop-Up Window, or Koma Inu, or Resistor, have to worry about the existence of Parasite, and so therefore the existence of Parasite diversifies the types of ice that the corporation is willing to use, because they want to include some high-strength ice so that they can be more resistant to Parasite. I'll also go back briefly and talk about the big boy's defense of Yogg, because Although I hated Yogg, Big Boy has a very good argument for why Yogg is acceptable. People usually say, well, Yogg breaks the diversity of ice for the corporation because code gates with low strength are useless. You don't want to include any of them, so all code gates end up clustering around 4 and 5 strength. But what actually happens is that's not the case. Now, that would be the case if Yogg were so dominant that it was in every deck, but it's not. So corporations want to include some low strength ice, like Enigma or Pop Up Window, for the decks that don't have Yogg. But for the decks that do have Yogg, they have to go out and include high strength code gates as well. So instead of just jamming the 3 best ice of each category, the corporation is forced to diversify what they have so that they can meet different threats, which I think is a valid argument in Yogg's favor. Okay, next we're going to talk about the Anarch draw engine. This is commonly called Wild Cakes, and both sides of this combo have been modified in some way. It was a pretty dominant way of drawing cards in the Anarch faction historically, and part of it's been nerfed and part of it's been buffed. Wild Side, which was the core of the combo, has been buffed, whereas Adjusted Chronotype has actually been nerfed. Overall, the combo is 1 credit more expensive than it used to be, but it's easier to get it going. Because Wild Side basically says your first click of the turn is automatically spent drawing 2 cards. You lose that click, but you get 2 cards at the start of each turn. That's a really helpful work impression, especially because typically speaking, it costs you 1 click to draw 1 card. So it's fairly efficient, but it does limit the number of runs that you can make in a round, right? You can only make 3 runs in a round because the runner only has 4 clicks. So there's some cards that need you to be able to have 4 clicks in a turn. Wild Side prevents you from using those. So the combo is that you use Adjusted Chronotype, which basically prevents you from losing that first click. It's now 7 credits to use the whole thing, so it's quite expensive, and it can be very deadly into NBN tag decks who can dispose of the Adjusted Chronotype or the Wild Side. But still can be quite useful, especially with Faust, which we'll get to talking about soon. Next is Imp. Imp is one of my all-time favorite cards. It's a super fun, super useful program. It's a virus, just like many of these other cards. It costs 2, hasn't been changed. It gets 2 virus counters on it, and once per turn, you can spend one of those virus counters to trash a card that you access at no cost, even if it could not normally be trashed. So some corporation cards, like assets and upgrades, can be trashed by paying some amount of money. Ice and operations basically being spells, cannot be trashed typically. But you can use an Imp to get rid of those cards and basically start raiding your opponent's hand and knocking out the important stuff. The other nice thing about Imp is that it allows you to continue hammering a central server and increasing your odds of getting something useful. For example, let's say that your opponent has 5 cards in their hand. You run on their hand with an Imp active, and you see a hedge fund. Okay? Hedge fund, besides being a very useful, very important card, you randomly access a card, right? So that hedge fund is preventing you from seeing any agendas that are in the hand or anything that's more valuable. So what you can do, let's say that they have 1 agenda in hand. If you Imp the hedge fund, now you go the next time you run on their hand from having a 20% chance of hitting the agenda to having a 25% chance of hitting the agenda. And the odds get better if you have multi-access. So Imp can be extremely helpful. You can also use it to trash high trash cost cards without having to pay the cost. So let's say that you run a 5 cost asset. Maybe you don't have the money to trash that right now, but you can trash it for free with the Imp. The last thing that you can use Imp for that is really handy is that you can use Imp's trash ability to trash a card that has a agenda that has a defensive effect. Normally you would not want to trash an agenda with Imp, but there are some situations where it might be really useful. For example, the Future Perfect is a Jinteki agenda that it's very hard to steal from HQ or R&D. So you can imp the card to put it in archives where it's easy for you to continue hitting and much easier for you to steal. And that's imp. Very, very useful card. Often played in decks that like to recur it. Use cards like Scavenge. Shaper decks like this card, as do many Anarch decks. It's good to have around. It's also helpful against many archetypes of corporation that rely on operations, aka spells, to accomplish their win condition. For example, kill decks often use Scorched Earth or SEA Source in order to win. If you can imp the SEA Source, sometimes you may have completely lobotomized their win condition and therefore had a much easier time of winning. Okay. Is that a second data sucker slide? I'm sorry. That shouldn't be there. Okay. Anarch economy. So the Anarch economy, you've got a few different options. One of my favorites here is Queen's Gambit. I don't play this in very many decks, but I think it's really cool and core to the sort of back and forth that the game is about. Bluffing, traps, trying to read your opponent, right? If you play Queen's Gambit, essentially you advance your opponent's cards. Normally that's very bad. This is a reverse Mushin notion, but it gives you 6 credits. Quite handy. That's 3 credits per action. And if you know for a fact that your opponent's card is a Red Herrings, or a Caprice, or just a Cerebral Overwriter, you can Queen's Gambit the card and make a ton of money, and make the corporation player feel very stupid. But the more commonly used Anarch economy cards are Day Job and Liberated Account. Liberated Account hasn't been changed from the original game. It is a 6-cost resource that has 16 credits on it, and you can click it to take $4 off of it. So basically, there's some very interesting economic analysis that can be applied to Liberated Account. The first is that the 6 cost is very severe. So in order to make your money back on Liberated Account, you have to click it at least twice. After you've clicked Liberated Account twice, you've made 8 credits. But remember that you did install the Liberated Account too, and you need to pay 6, right? So you install Liberated Account, and you click it twice. That's 3 clicks. If you had not done that, and just clicked for credits 3 times, you'd have 9 credits, which is actually more than the 8 credits that you got from clicking the Liberated Account twice. So, in truth, you're not ahead on credits until you've clicked the Liberated Account 3 times. But the advantage of the card is that it lets you burst up your economy and quickly recover from difficult situations. And it's good with cards like Career Fair. So, for example, let's say you go and you go all in on a server and you bust a remote. You go down to 1 or 2, maybe 0 credits. Well, now the corporation, hypothetically, should have a scoring window. They should be able to say, the runner's broke, they can't afford to get into my server, and now I can put an agenda in my server, and they're not going to be able to afford to get in. But when you have a Liberated Account installed, you can spend a click or 2, go all the way back up to 8 credits, and then you can get back into the account. So Liberated Account is pretty helpful for just sort of allowing you to push your way through. The other nice thing about it is that it's fairly click efficient. It's very time efficient. If you're already rich, you can use Liberated Account a few times. And a lot of times, the amount of time that you're spending on it is very important. Especially if you have a wild side and you don't have that many clicks to begin with. And if you're going, like let's say you're playing Account Siphon, which usually Anarchs don't play, the nice thing about Liberated Account is you can install it, click it, and you've already taken half the money off the account. So the corporation often isn't incentivized to trash it at that point. Now the alternative, which is a spell, it's a Day Job here, it's an event, is basically spending your entire turn to gain 10 credits. Well, that's the original card. It got buffed a little bit to 11 credits. When you think about the cost to play it, you're basically gaining 9 for 3 credits, for 3 clicks. That's pretty good. That's 3 credits per click. The main downside of Day Job is that it just costs so much effort to play it. But basically, if you want to take your turn off and say, I'm going to go ahead and just prepare for the future, Day Job is very effective. I would consider this a staple economy card. Usually decks are more interested in playing Liberated Account, but I think that there's an argument that Day Job is a better card, in fact. Okay. Now, it's interesting that I've noticed, at least in Reboot, that it seems like although the Anarch fixed strength breakers are the traditional way of breaking into servers, Ice has gotten effective enough that sometimes Mimic and Yogg are just simply not enough sometimes to get through what you need to do. And there's a totally alternative strategy using the Keyhole program that basically doesn't try to contest remotes at all. It's a very interesting strategy, and it reminds me a lot, if you're familiar with this deck from Magic the Gathering, of essentially Lantern Control. So the idea of Keyhole is that you make a run on your opponent's deck, and instead of the normal one access that you would get, you access no cards at all, but you look at the top 3 cards of their deck, and then you take one and you throw it in their discard pile, and then shuffle their deck. So the first level application of this is that you get to look at 3 cards, search for an agenda instead of 1, and throw those agendas in the discard pile. And that's the eventual win condition of Keyhole. But early in the game, it's often better not to choose those agendas. It's often better to target your opponent's economy cards and their ice cards and leave them in a situation where their deck is just full of agendas that they cannot score because they don't have any way to protect them and they don't have any money. Now, Keyhole is the first program we're going to talk about that has a 2 memory cost. That's pretty expensive, and what it means in practice is that it's very difficult to play Keyhole with a sophisticated breaker suite. You can't really install Keyhole and Corroder and Yogg and Mimic. At that point, you're talking about having at least 5 MU, and while you could do that, your entire strategy is going to be destroyed if your opponent puts a toll booth on R&D, because a toll booth is too high of a strength of a code gate for your Yogg to break, and you don't have enough memory to play any data suckers. So what oftentimes people use with the Keyhole is a program called Eater. Eater and Keyhole have a perfect little combo here, because Eater is a very weird ice that doesn't look very good. Icebreaker that doesn't look very good. It costs 4, which is pretty expensive, and it has the basic Corroder rate. 1 to boost and 1 to break. But in order to use Eater, you have to forego the ability to access any cards at all during the run. So the reason the Eater works with Keyhole is that Keyhole, you're not accessing cards. You're just breaking through so that you can look at their cards and throw them in the trash. So Eater Keyhole ends up being a very potent combo. It allows you to only spend 3 MU on your breakers and then get through. The problem is those agendas are not removed from the game. They're put in archives. And if your opponent wants to ice archives, Eater and Keyhole is not going to be enough. Because if you break any of the archives of ice with Eater, then you can't actually access the cards in archives. There's a few different ways that decks get around this. We'll talk about that later. But this is a nice little alternative breaker package that a lot of Anarch decks will use. I've seen Valencia use this. I've seen Max be the most common user of Eater and Keyhole. And then also other decks too, like Wizard as well sometimes. Okay. Now, the next card we want to talk about here is David. And David performs a very interesting role in the Anarch card pool. It's a program, but it's not an icebreaker, and it's not an AI. It's a slingshot that comes with 3 counters on it, and you can spend a counter on it to break a subroutine on an ice that has 5 or greater strength. So what David does, which is so interesting, is that it fills the hole left by the fixed strength breakers. These breakers are very efficient at killing low strength ice, and then you have David helping you with the high strength ice. Now, you might notice here that you end up in this very awkward situation with 4 strength ice, because 4 strength ice can't be broken by David and can't be broken by the fixed strength breakers. And that is a noticeable problem for Anarch. Now, if Anarch has data sucker counters, they can reduce the 4 strength ice to 3 strength ice, and then they're fine. but there is a card called Lotus Field that cannot have its strength reduced. So oftentimes, Anarchs on their own, if they don't spend influence, are hard stopped by a Lotus Field, and they have to basically find alternative solutions. David is a very powerful card for 3 cost and 1 MU. And originally it had 4 influence, and that got increased up to 5 influence in Reboot. So now it's very difficult for non-Anarch factions to play David. And what's funny is that Shapers still do it. Shapers will still pay the 5 influence to have a copy of David if they can. It's just a very handy card to have. This is very effective with Scavenge, very useful when put back into play. And what is nice about it is that it usually lets you keep yourself covered against the most threatening things against the standard Anarch rig. That's the role that David plays in the game. Now, I don't know if this is meta relevant or not, but I am going to talk about another interesting element of the Ice and Icebreaker interaction, which is Black Cat. It's a card that was significantly buffed in Reboot. It's a Fractor, which means it deals with barrier cards, and it's had its cost halved. As you might notice here, it's a very high strength at 3 strength. That's the same as a Mimic, so higher than a Corroder. And it breaks 1 barrier subroutine for 1 credit, same as a Corroder does. But it boosts its strength inefficiently. 2 credits to increase 1 strength. But if you use a subset of the card pool called stealth cards, which are sort of a parasitic mechanic that doesn't usually get used, but sometimes may see some play, you can boost the strength much more efficiently and break many more subroutines. One of the reasons that I included Black Cat in this Anarch presentation is because I think it does a good job of talking about what the different factions are good at. So Switchblade here is a criminal card that does sentries. We have Refractor, which is a Shaper card which deals with code gates, and we have Black Cat, which is a Anarch card that deals with barriers. So this is talking sort of about the color pie of the different factions, what they do well and what they don't. And what Anarch is good at is busting down walls. What it's not so good at is breaking code gates. So barriers mostly just keep you out of a server. They say end the run on them. They're the hard stops. Sentries are the punishing cards, the cards that are going to really pants you and give you a swirly. And then code gates are somewhere in between. They usually have funky kind of creative effects. Sometimes they end the run, sometimes they really punish you. They can do a little bit of both, a little bit of either. And code gates are just the ones that criminals aren't very good at, or at least they're not supposed to be. That's part of the interesting aspect of Yogg. So, anyway, that's stealth and sort of the color pie of criminals being good at breaking sentries. Part of the reason for that is that criminals like to run a lot. And so if you want to run a lot, you need some insurance against the most dangerous effects. Versus Anarchs, which are mostly good at smashing things. Okay. Next, we've got I've Had Worse. I've Had Worse is one of the premier draw engines of the Anarch faction. It's a fantastically useful card. I love the modality of it. It's basically a diesel that costs money, but it automatically casts itself when you take damage. So it's great against Scorched Earth. It's great against Jinteki. If you have Wildside installed, typically I won't cast this because at that point it's going to cost you a lot of money, but it's really handy to have, and it triggers off of either team damaging you. Oftentimes players can damage themselves with cards like Net Ready Eyes, and I've Had Worse will trigger in those situations. So I've Had Worse is a staple. It's an essential Anarch card that helps make you more resilient to damaging archetypes, while also just being generally pretty useful. Next we have Clot, and Clot technically I'm including here because it's an Anarch card, even though Clot is kind of not an Anarch card. It's a very weird card. It's a virus, so maybe Noise would want to install, pack one of these in some of his decks, but I don't know that I've ever seen an Anarch actually run Clot. It's an anti-fast advance tool. and it's a kind of a controversial card. If you're not familiar with Fast Advance, the concept of Fast Advance is basically the corporation taking an agenda and scoring it all in one turn from their hand without giving the runner a chance to respond. Hypothetically, a very powerful strategy. And Fast Advance had to experience several nerfs in the Reboot project in order to make it more acceptable. But Clot was printed by Fantasy Flight at a time when Fast Advance was extremely powerful as a silver bullet card that hard stops Fast Advance decks. Because what Clot says is the corporation cannot score an agenda on the same turn they install it. So you just straight up can't Fast Advance cards. You can't do it. But the advantage of Clot here is that, at least from the corporation's perspective, is that they can address it. It's not going to end their game, because if they skip their turn to purge virus counters, it'll be removed from the game. Let me double check here. I thought that Clot was nerfed, but I didn't include it on the spreadsheet, so now I have to check. Where is regular Netrunner DB? Let me just look it up. Clot Netrunner. Yeah, okay, so this in fact was nerfed, and I just neglected to put it in the PowerPoint here. But basically, the original Clot was sent to the discard pile when the corporation purged, which was a temporary solution. But basically, if you have program recursion, you can just bring the Clot back over and over again, and it essentially hard killed any Fast Advance deck. Now the card has been nerfed in this reboot, where it's removed from the game when the corporation skips their turn to purge virus counters. So it's a permanent solution to the problem. This card's almost exclusively played out of Shaper, which is one reason why I have the Shaper logo here, because Shaper has the best ways of recurring Clot, of tutoring out Clot, of basically putting Clot into play at instant speed to stymie the corporation. So it's an important card, but it's not really much of an Anarch card. But that's why I have it here. Okay, now for the Big Daddy, Faust. So Faust was probably one of the most broken cards in Fantasy Flight game Netrunner at the time that it was, at the time of the game that Reboot is set in. In 2016, Faust was an absolutely dominant AI icebreaker. This is the first AI that we've talked about. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about what AIs are. AIs are icebreakers that hypothetically have enough intelligence to where they can break any type of ice. It can be a sentry, can be a code gate, could be a barrier. Because of this flexibility, AIs always tend to be kind of inefficient. Because if an AI ever becomes particularly efficient, then the entire icebreaker interaction breaks down, right? There's no reason to include, a mimic in your deck if you can just do it better with an icebreaker that can also break barriers and also break sentries or code gates. So that's part of why AIs had to be nerfed, and Faust in particular was heavily nerfed. The original Faust basically said discard a card to break a subroutine. It's pretty efficient, especially if you're playing this with, as most people did, wild cakes with the wild side and the adjusted chronotype. But at 2 strength, you'd have to trash even more cards from your hand to increase the strength. Originally, it was only 1 card to go up 2 strength. So if you ran into a 6 strength card with 1 subroutine, okay, so that's 2 cards from hand to get to 6, and 1 card to break this up. That's 3 cards to break a 6 strength card. You can see how that might be a little bit overpowered. Well, it's basically had its effectiveness halved in Reboot. Now, the subroutine breaking is as efficient as it was, but you have to trash 3 cards from your grip instead of 1 to go up to 2 strength. So it's not even halved. It's actually a third as effective as at boosting itself. Now, if you have an effective data sucker suite of just accumulating virus counters to lower ice strength, then this nerf may not affect you very much. But what it means is that Faust is now much more dependent on lowering the strength of ice in order to be effective. Because now let's say we want to break a toll booth. That's a 6 strength, 1 subroutine ice. Okay, so to get to 6 strength, we're going to have to trash 6 cards from our grip, and then 1 from our hand to break this up. We're talking about 7 cards. So the cost to break toll booth is more than doubled. And remember that the hand size limit in this game is 5 cards. So we're talking about making it much more inefficient. So I'm really happy with where Faust has landed. Now I think it's a very appropriate card. In order to use it, you're going to have to discard more cards than you're comfortable with, and it also relies on being supported in order to work. Whereas the original Faust was just simply too efficient at everything. So if you played Fantasy Flight's Netrunner back in its heyday, you might be afraid of a card like this. I think you can be comfortable that it's much more balanced than it was at the time. Okay, so now I'm just gonna, that's kind of the main card pool staples. Now I'm just gonna talk about the different leaders that find themselves inside of the Anarch faction, starting with Wizard. Wizard, I believe, Wizard, I believe, a reference to Discworld with his double Z's, is the first Anarch that was released after the core set with Noise. And Wizard basically sticks to the color pie of Anarch of loving to trash things. He gives you 3 what's called recurring credits, or credits that replenish themselves every turn, with which you can trash cards. So if you see a card with 5 trash cost, you have to pay 2 credits, but you can use the 3 on Wizard to trash it. Now if you run to another card, let's say a 2 cost card after that, you've already used your 3 credits, but they will come back at the start of your next turn. So Wizard didn't start out being a dominant runner in Fantasy Flight's version of the game. He was okay. He was not as good as Noise at cheesing the game out and milling and things like that for the most part. He was better against horizontal decks that built lots of servers, but those decks weren't especially powerful in the early versions of the game, so Wizard didn't see a ton of play. But eventually, around the time that the game, in the view of many people's opinions, sort of fell off, asset-based decks that built million servers and tried to put the runner into a prison became very popular. And when that happened, Wizard became such an important meta game call that he was almost one of the only runners that you could play. Wizard was absolutely meta-defining as one of the only viable answers to the asset spam decks of the Mumbad and Flashpoint eras. And it wasn't necessarily because Wizard himself was overpowered, but it was because he was really the only way that you could fight against this sort of dominant strategy. And in response to this, Wizard has had his influence nerfed somewhat, so he went from 15 influence down to 12. I think this is reasonable, although Wizard now exists in kind of an awkward spot where he doesn't do all that well against more vertical decks. Against Glacier, for example, I think Wizard ends up being significantly worse than a lot of the other runners. But he can still dominate against, Near Earth Hub and other horizontal decks. So he's very much, I would say at this point, still matchup-based runner. But he's a lot of fun. And the original breakthrough Wizard deck was called Dumblefork, and it basically used a majority of these cards. It used Faust, it used David, it used Wild Cakes, and it basically just went and it busted through every server and used Faust to kind of get in everywhere. It's a ton of fun, and the majority of the constituent parts of Dumblefork have been nerfed. Both Wizard himself, Adjusted Chronotype, Faust. So the deck still exists in Reboot, but it's significantly more balanced than it was. Up in the corner there, you can see Kevin Wilson, a legendary Fantasy Flight Games designer, who is the inspiration for Wizards. Fantasy Flight had a policy where you got to do a cameo in one of their games after you had a certain level of seniority at the studio, and this was Kevin Wilson's cameo. So, there you go. This is the pre-constructed deck for Double Fork that exists in the Reboot game now. If you're not familiar with what that means, to help ease people into playing the game, maybe that are used to Nisei Group Netrunner or old Netrunner or just aren't familiar with Netrunner at all, you've got these reasonably high-powered pre-constructed decks that players can just jump in and play to get a sense of the card pool to kind of learn how to play. And this is the preview for the Dumble Fork one. So you can see we've talked about many of these cards. This is kind of what Dumble Fork looks like. And if you want to jump in, then that's a super easy way to do that. Next up, we've got Edward Kim. Edward actually came out later in the game than Wizard did, but I'm talking about him because he's a fairly similar leader to Wizard, sort of in the same way that like Helena and Armand are similar leaders. So I'm grouping them together on that basis. And Edward was a little bit matchup dependent himself. He got a small buff and his influence was increased from 15 to 17. This means that now Edward can splash a lot of cross-faction synergies. And for that reason, he's oftentimes the leader that people play the stealth deck in, because he has more than average amount of influence to import cards like, Switchblade and Refractor into the Anarch package. Edward Kim trashes the first operation he accesses at no cost. This is absolutely fantastic against Psychographics decks, against Scorch Kill decks, and also it's very good against Fast Advance decks. You run into a Biotic Labor or a Scorched Earth, you can immediately just dump it out of the hand. It's a little bit weird because it's an imp that only works for operation spells. It does not work at all for ice. So a lot of times you still are considering bringing in your own imps. But it's nice to have an imp that is attached to the identity. And he also has, we haven't talked about this yet, but he has a base link. A link it's a small economic advantage to the runner. It basically means the runner starts with a free credit on all auctions that the corp and the runner engage in. So there's a mechanic called Trace in the game that are sequential auctions, and this basically means that Kim is a little bit better at those auctions than Wizard is, because Wizard only has 0 link and Noise also only has 0 link. One thing that these guys have in common is they like to use what's called the trash package. This is sort of the first look at some of the new cards that the big boy has added to Netrunner. So new console for Kim like Glee, and then we also have Snicker and Human Rights Riot. So to sort of explain these, Glee is a console just like Grimoire. It only provides 1 MU though, so worse in that respect. And whenever a corp card is trashed during a run on a central server, you gain some money. So I think it's fair to say that matching the pattern of the new cards that Big Boy added, not being meta defining and not pushing the envelope typically, Glee is pretty clearly worse than Grimoire. But what it does do is it allows the runner to have a new deck they can build based around doing Kim things, where you're getting paid every time you smack a card out of your opponent's hand, which, let's be honest, is a lot of fun. And you've got Snicker here, which basically says you get to draw a card if you trash a corp card this turn. Pretty handy. And then Human Rights Riot is really the core Kim card, and also a good card for Wizard. You often end up playing the same sets of cards in these guys, especially if you're not playing the Dumble Fork list. Dumble Fork doesn't play any of these cards, and this precon doesn't play any of these cards because Big Boy constructed the precons without any of his new cards so that players would be more comfortable getting into them and also have some space to improve them with other cards if they wanted to. Human Rights Riot doubles down on the trashing. It basically says when you smack a card out of a central server, be it from their deck or their hand, you get some money for it, just like with Glee, but you also get to make them trash an additional card out of their HQ. And it can end up making a situation where you're putting a lot of pressure on your opponent and forcing them to choose between 2 bad outcomes, which is what I really enjoy about it. This card used to say random discard. So it used to randomly discard a card from your opponent's hand, and this was apparently too powerful, so they had to nerf it. I, for one, am a sadist who enjoys random discard. I love that type of thing. But other players disagree. So, uh, very well. I'll settle for a Test of Humanity, Reverend Mother type effect if I have to. It's still enjoyable to play. Next, we have Reina Roja. Reina Roja. I'm not Hispanic, but I'm doing my best on this one. Means the Red Queen. And Reina is very interesting in that she embodies a almost criminal style play style in the Anarch faction. She's doing something different from the other Anarchs. What she's doing is she's trying to deny the corporation as much as possible. People like to talk about headlock. Basically, stacking up effects that make everything that the corporation does more expensive, make it hard for them to be able to afford their ice, make it hard for them to be able to afford to advance cards, and try to take advantage of that by selectively making calls and running servers where you think that they cannot res their ice, things like that. So Reina's a lot of fun. I've experimented with her a few times. I don't remember her being especially weak, but when I have tried to play her in Reboot, I have found her lacking. So I hope that people can come into Reboot and experiment with Reina and find a way to make her work, but in my experience, she's just not as good as some of the other Anarchs, unfortunately. She was reprinted by Nisei in their System Core 2019, and I thought she was pretty decent in that format. So I don't know if it has to do with the card pool or what, but Reina's enjoyable. She's based around, again, credit denial on increasing the cost of your opponent's ice to res. You can stack that with Xanadu, you can stack that with Rook, and you can also stack that with a new card that Big Boy added called Molotov, which I'm not going to get into right now. Next we have Quetzal, or Quetzal. I guess it's probably Quetzal. And Quetzal is very interesting. She's got her own little, David-style effect on her that says that once per turn, she can break a single barrier subroutine. So to state the obvious, it's only one subroutine, one time per turn. And this is one of the reasons that Quetzal is not very good. But it does make her very aggressive and useful against decks that want to use barriers to try to score out early, right? An ice wall does not bother Quetzal, nor does a wall of static. And an Eli is not especially good for Quetzal, but she can click the other subroutine. She can still get through, makes it cheaper for her. What's really not good for Quetzal is that she ends up getting stonewalled by things like Spiderweb. Unfortunately, breaking one barrier subroutine per turn is not a substitute for having a Fractor, and it's not a substitute for having a Rig. But it does allow you to be more aggressive early, and it is kind of interesting. There's some players out there who have used Quetzal with ice subtype changing effects from Shaper and had some success with it, but I have never had success with it, and I don't find it especially interesting. So that's all I'm going to say about Quetzal. Next, we have Max. Max has a pedigree of being a very effective runner, but she is not as overpowered in the Reboot version of the game because the Reboot version of the game lacks some of the recursive threats that Fantasy Flight's version of the game had near the end of its lifespan. What she does is she draws one card and she just mills the top two card of her deck at the start of her turn. Now, runners, unlike corporations and Magic the Gathering players, do not lose the game when they can't draw a card. So, eventually with Max, you can get to a state where your deck is empty and still keep playing. As long as nobody does damage to you, you'll be okay. The nice thing about Max is you have a constant flow of cards. This is very efficient. You can also set up your graveyard for some effects. That can sometimes have an effect as well. She's got 45-15, the basic stat line, and the card draw is a useful effect for many different types of decks. Any kind of combo deck can be effective when run out of Max, and Max is often effective in those roles. Max has a precon, and the precon is based around the Keyhole and Eater combo. Mostly because for these cards to work, you usually have to have both of them. So Max's card draw allows you to more consistently get that to go off. But you can use Max in other strategies too. You could use Max Stealth, for example, or you could do a lot of other different things with Max. Doesn't necessarily have to be Eater and Keyhole. I think that tends to be what's most effective. Max almost always runs a card from Shaper that shuffles your discard pile into your deck and forms a new deck, because she can run through her deck surprisingly quickly, and then as soon as you do that, you basically don't get the advantage of your card draw anymore. She's a very interesting runner that I'd like to get a little bit more experience with. She's strong, but she's not as powerful as she used to be. Next up is Valencia. Valencia, in the Fantasy Flight version of the game, ended up being very dominant for a couple different reasons. And you can tell that Fantasy Flight knew that it was going to be powerful, because they basically pre-nerfed her, right? They gave her a 50 deck size. In card games, generally speaking, deck thinning is deck winning. And having a 50 card deck is generally considered to be less consistent and less useful than having a 45 card deck like what Max has. So Fantasy Flight already knew that this was going to be effective. If you don't know what bad publicity is 1 free credit for every run that you spend, that you go on, that is useful only for the duration of that run. So you don't get to bank the credit. It's not like Desperado, but in practice it means that every asset is 1 credit cheaper to trash, and that you can break into servers with icebreakers more cheaply as well. You can also use activated abilities with this credit, so it gives itself a lot of flexibility. In the Fantasy Flight version of the game, Valencia ended up becoming very powerful, especially by the end of the game's lifespan, and she's been nerfed in this version where she's had her influence cut. So as you can see by some of the consistent nerfs across the board to this faction, not to Kim, but to many of the other cards here, you can see that generally speaking, cards are getting nerfed. Anarch was the dominant runner faction in the game at the end of its lifespan, at least around 2016 it was. And so adjustments are being made in this case to make Anarchs a little bit more fair to play against. Having to have a 50 size deck, but only having 12 influence to spend, means that you're basically forced to make a lot of concessions on your deck building, because you're including a lot of Anarch cards, and maybe some Anarch cards that you don't necessarily need. Valencia is fun. I think Valencia ends up being a fairly generic runner that is relatively decent against asset spam, is relatively good at breaking, but doesn't have anything crazy to do. And a lot of times this means that she ends up going into the Keyhole engine, because she doesn't have any crazy win condition associated with her. She's very much the standard Anarch. And then lastly, the last card I'm going to talk about today for the Anarchs is the new one. So every single faction in the game, besides the mini factions, which we'll talk about later, has a new leader that's included in their card pool. And this is the one for the Anarchs. It's called the Horde. And it reminds me a lot of Tessia, because it's so wordy. It's not that complicated, but you have this series of effects that you resolve in an order. It's not my favorite identity. I really love Anarch, but I don't super enjoy the Horde. But basically, every time you successfully access the relevant centrals, aka headquarters or R&D, it ticks itself up with power counters, and then you get the corresponding effects. So it starts out by gaining money, then drawing cards, then damaging yourself and getting more clicks, which are time, forcing the corp to lose $1, trashing cards that you wouldn't normally be able to trash, and then all of the above. So the Horde is very powerful. I've played Horde a lot against Gaslight, who's one of our most common players who's looking for games. I don't think I've ever beat his Horde deck. It's very powerful. I'm probably overestimating its strength. Gaslight's a strong player, so that might be part of it. But that's another way that it reminds me of Tessia. Now, that being said, Big Boy knew that it was going to be powerful, so he put it at 50 deck size. I haven't seen it that much in the tournament that I'm playing right now. We've got a asynchronous constructed tournament, and I haven't seen anyone playing Horde, so maybe it's not that strong, but it definitely does a lot of work, and I would highly encourage you guys to give it a shot. So that's going to be the end of my first video in this series, where I'm going to be talking about all the different card pools in Android Netrunner Rebooted. in the description of the video, I'm going to include a link to our Discord, so that if you guys decide you want to get some games in with me, you can if you want to. I'm also going to include the link to our website that we play on called Reteki, as well as to Goblin Mode and some of the other people that I discussed in the earlier parts of the video. If you've made it all the way to the end here, then thank you so much for your patience, and I hope you enjoy what we're putting out here. Dune Imperium is not done. I'm still going to be making Dune videos, but I wanted to shine a spotlight on Netrunner Reboot because I think it's just an amazing and underappreciated project. I hope to see some of you guys there.